The Honda Accord sat behind the abandoned gas station like a wounded animal that had crawled somewhere quiet to die. A 1998 model, 230,000 miles on the odometer, rust eating through the wheel wells, a crack spidering across the windshield from a rock that had kicked up on Route 4 sometime back in 2019, back when fixing a windshield was still something Thomas Hollowell could afford. November in Vermont. The temperature had dropped below zero 2 hours ago and was still falling. Frost crawled across the glass from all four corners, slowly erasing the world outside until there was nothing left but the dim orange glow of a streetlight 50 yards away, flickering like it couldn't decide whether to stay on or give up entirely. Inside the car, two people were trying to sleep. Thomas Hollowell, 70 years old, sat in the driver's seat with his hands resting on the steering wheel. He wasn't driving anywhere. There was no gas for that. But his hands found the wheel the way they always did, out of 30 years of habit, out of the deeply rooted belief that a man behind a wheel is a man in control of something, even when he controlled nothing at all. In the back seat, curled beneath a thin blanket in a coat that had lost its zipper 3 weeks ago, Margaret Hollowell coughed. Not the kind of cough that clears and goes away, the kind that settles into the chest and builds a home there. The kind that gets worse every night when the cold comes, and in Vermont in November, the cold always comes. Tom listened to his wife cough and felt something worse than fear. He felt useless. For 45 years, he had been the man who fixed things. Broken lockers at the high school, leaking faucets in the teacher's lounge, a fence post that came loose after a storm. If something was broken, Tom Hollowell showed up with his toolkit and his quiet competence, and he made it right. That was who he was. That was what he did. But he could not fix this. He could not fix the fact that his wife was sick and sleeping in a car. He could not fix the fact that the wallet sitting on the dashboard contained $3 bills and 17 cents. He could not fix the fact that everything they had built in 45 years of marriage, every dollar saved, every mortgage payment, made every small and careful decision that was supposed to add up to a dignified old age, had been devoured by a disease that nearly killed him, and a medical system that finished the job on their finances. $3.17. That was what remained of Thomas and Margaret Hollowell. That was the sum total of 70 years of living and 45 years of loving and 30 years of honest work. $3. Some change. And a car that smelled like the cheap fast food they could barely afford. Tom reached his left hand back between the seats and rested it on Maggie's shoulder. She stirred but didn't wake. Her breathing was ragged, interrupted by small coughs that she tried to suppress even in her sleep, because even unconscious Maggie Hollowell was trying not to be a burden. He kept his hand there and stared at the frosted windshield and tried not to think about what would happen when the temperature dropped further, when the cough became pneumonia, when $3 became zero, when the car finally died and there was nothing between them and a Vermont winter except the clothes on their backs. He tried not to think about it. But at 2 in the morning in a freezing car behind an abandoned gas station, there wasn't much else to think about. 3 years ago, none of this was imaginable. 3 years ago, Tom and Maggie Hollowell lived in a small house on Maple Street in Riverside, Vermont. Nothing fancy. A 2-bedroom Cape Cod with white clapboard siding and a blue front door that Tom had painted himself because Maggie loved the ocean, and he figured if he couldn't give her a house by the sea, he could at least give her a door the color of it. The house was paid off. 25 years of mortgage payments, never a single one late. The day Tom mailed the final check, he stopped at the roadside on his way home and picked a handful of wildflowers for Maggie because the ones in the flower shop cost $12, and he thought that was absurd when the same God who made those grew these for free. Maggie dried that bouquet and kept it on the bookshelf for 20 years. Riverside was a town of 4,000 people where everybody knew everybody, where your reputation was currency, where a handshake still meant something. Tom had been part of the fabric of that town for 3 decades. He was the maintenance man at Riverside High School, and if that sounds like a small job, then you never met Tom Hollowell. He arrived at the school every morning at 5 to clear the parking lot of snow so parents could drop their children safely. He fixed lockers that jammed, replaced light bulbs in the gymnasium, repaired the heating system when it failed in January, patched the roof when it leaked in April. 3 generations of students at Riverside High knew him as Mr. Tom. They knew that if your locker was stuck, Mr. Tom would have it open in 30 seconds. They knew that if you dropped your lunch tray and made a mess, Mr. Tom would appear with a mop and not a single word of judgment. He never earned much. Maintenance workers at small-town high schools don't. But Tom believed in a simple code. Work hard, owe nothing, take care of your own. His father had built the family house with his own hands. Timber he felled himself, foundation he poured himself, and died at 82 in his own bed, knowing he had provided for his family every single day of his life. Tom intended to do the same. Maggie worked part-time at the public library shelving books and helping patrons and reading voraciously during quiet afternoons. She was the kind of woman who noticed things other people missed. Small things. A change in someone's voice that meant they were lying, a stray cat that always appeared before rain, a piece of furniture at a yard sale that everyone else walked past but that Maggie would touch with her fingers and say, "Tom, this one. Trust me." And she was always right. Tom called it her radar. 45 years of marriage had taught him that when Maggie said she felt something, it wasn't a guess. It was something deeper, something he couldn't explain and had stopped trying to because the results spoke for themselves. Their life was not exciting. It was not the kind of life anyone would make a movie about. It was Sunday mornings with coffee in the newspaper. It was Tom on the back porch sanding wood for a new bookshelf, while Maggie sat beside him reading, neither of them speaking for an hour, because after 45 years, silence between two people who understand each other is not empty. It is full. It was the smell of cinnamon rolls on Saturday mornings, Maggie's recipe, the one she had made every weekend since their first year of marriage, the one that filled the kitchen with warmth and sweetness and the unspoken assurance that everything was exactly as it should be. It was Tom reaching across the breakfast table to touch her hand when she set down his plate, a gesture so small and so habitual that neither of them noticed it anymore. And that was the point. Love at this stage of life does not announce itself. It simply exists like breathing, like the walls of a house you have lived in so long, you forget they are there until the day they are gone. Their life was small and ordinary and good, and they had every reason to believe it would stay that way until the end. Then came March, 2 years before the night in the Honda. Tom had been hiding the stomach pain for 2 months, because that was what Tom Hollowell did. He did not complain. He did not burden others. He certainly did not go to a doctor for a stomachache, because men of his generation and disposition did not do that. You took an antacid and you went to work and you said nothing. But Maggie noticed. Of course she did. She noticed the way he winced when he bent down, the way he pushed his dinner plate away half finished, the way he sat on the edge of the bed at night, hand pressed against his abdomen, thinking she was asleep. She wasn't asleep. She gave him 2 months because she knew Tom. She knew that pushing too soon would make him dig in. Then one morning she set his coffee down and said, "Tom, you are going to the doctor today, or I'm going to call an ambulance and tell them you are having a heart attack and let them sort it out." He went. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. The doctor said the word and the room changed. Not the furniture or the lights or the temperature, but it's something else. The future. One second it was there, stretching out ahead of them, ordinary and reliable. The next second it was gone, replaced by a 20% survival rate and a treatment plan that read like a war campaign. Tom did not cry in the doctor's office. He did not speak. He sat perfectly still and watched Maggie across the examination room. She was nodding calm, writing things down, asking the right questions. How long? What kind? What are the options? What do we do first? Her handwriting was steady. Her voice did not shake. She was holding the world together with her bare hands, and Tom watched her do it and thought, this woman right here, I cannot leave her alone in this world. That night, after Maggie thought he was asleep, Tom sat on the back porch. The bookshelf he had been building for her lay half finished on the workbench, oak boards sanded, smooth joints measured and marked. He ran his hand along the wood and thought, I may never finish this. I may never sit here again. I may never bring Maggie her morning coffee again. He did not cry, but he made a decision. He would fight. Not for himself, because Tom Hollowell had never been a man who fought for himself. For her. When Maggie came out to the porch later, thinking he was inside and asleep, she found the chair empty and heard him in the workshop sanding. At 11 at night, in the cold. She watched him through the window for a long time. Then she went to the opposite end of the porch and sat down in her chair, the one she always read in, and cried. Not with despair, with fury, because it was not fair. because this quiet, decent, stubborn man deserved better than a 20% chance, because she could already see the dominoes falling: hospital bills, savings house, everything, and she could not stop them. Not a single one. She cried until she was empty. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and went inside and started making lists. Maggie Hollowell did not have time for despair. The cancer fight lasted 18 months. Surgery first, then chemotherapy that turned Tom inside out. There were nights he vomited until there was nothing left, and Maggie sat beside him on the bathroom floor and wiped his face and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Radiation followed, burning his skin, stealing his strength, reducing the man who once cleared snow at 5 in the morning to someone who could not walk to the mailbox without resting. One night during the worst of the chemo, Tom lay in his hospital bed, gray and hollowed out, and said to Maggie, "Maybe you should let me go. The cost of this is going to destroy us both." Maggie took his hand and squeezed it so hard he grimaced. "Thomas Hollowell, you listen to me. You do not get to quit. You do not get to give up. I will not allow it." It was the only time in 45 years of marriage that Tom had seen Maggie truly angry at him. And so he kept fighting, because she told him to, because she would not let him stop. And impossibly against all odds, he won. The cancer retreated, then vanished. 8 months clean. The doctors used the word miracle. Tom was alive. But the cost of that miracle was everything they owned. Insurance covered some, not nearly enough. The bills arrived in plain white envelopes that Maggie began to dread more than the disease itself, because at least the disease could be fought. The bills just kept coming, relentless and indifferent, generated by computers that did not know or care that the numbers on the page represented the destruction of 2 lives. $5,000 for a specialized scan that took 45 minutes and produced images that the oncologist needed to plan the next phase of treatment. $12,000 for a medication that the insurance company refused to cover because they classified it as experimental, even though it had been used successfully for 3 years at hospitals across the country. $8,000 for a procedure they deemed not medically necessary, and Tom would remember those words for the rest of his life: "not medically necessary," spoken by someone in an office somewhere who had never met him, who had never looked at his scan, who had made a decision about his body based on a cost-benefit analysis printed on a spreadsheet. The oncologist had called the insurance company directly, had argued, had even raised his voice, which Maggie had never heard a doctor do. Not medically necessary, they said. The procedure saved Tom's life. They still did not pay. Maggie handled the bills because Tom was too sick and too proud to look at them. She sat at the kitchen table every night after he fell asleep, sorting envelopes, making calls during business hours, from the hospital, hallway, negotiating payment plans, filing appeals, writing letters. She became fluent in the language of medical billing, a language designed to confuse and exhaust and ultimately defeat the people trying to navigate it. She learned what a CPT code was. She learned what an EOB was. She learned the difference between in-network and out-of-network, and the particular cruelty of discovering that the anesthesiologist who worked on your husband during surgery was out of network even though the hospital and the surgeon were in, and that this technical distinction meant an additional $4,000 that no one had told them about in advance. The savings went first, $38,000. It sounds like a lot of money, and it was, but it was not a lot of money the way people think. It was 30 years of discipline, $50 here from skipping a restaurant meal, $100 there from driving the old car another year instead of buying a new one. $20 a week every week for decades, the compound accumulation of a lifetime of saying no to small pleasures so that the future would be secure. Tom and Maggie had believed the way their parents had believed, that if you did everything right, if you worked hard and saved diligently and lived within your means, you would be protected, that the system would hold. It did not. $38,000 disappeared in 6 months, not gradually. In chunks, like a cliff eroding under waves, whole sections falling away at once. Then the second mortgage on the house. Maggie signed the papers in the bank, and her hand did not shake, because Maggie Hollowell did not allow her hand to shake when there was a document to sign. But that night she stood in the kitchen of their house on Maple Street and pressed her forehead against the refrigerator and stayed there for a long time, feeling the hum of the machine against her skin, thinking about how she had stood in this exact spot 25 years ago and thought, "This is ours. We made it. We are safe." When the second mortgage was not enough, they sold the house. The real estate agent was kind about it, which somehow made it worse. The house sold in 2 weeks because it was well maintained, because of course it was. Tom had maintained it the way he maintained everything, with care and consistency, and the belief that taking care of things was a form of respect. The day the sale closed, they drove past Maple Street one last time. The new owners had already started making changes. The blue front door, the one Tom had painted because Maggie loved the ocean, had been replaced with gray. A modern gray, the kind of gray that people who read design magazines choose because a website told them it was on trend. Maggie looked at the gray door and then looked away and did not look back again. They moved into a small apartment. Tom's position at the high school had been eliminated during his illness. Not fired, the school district was careful about that. Restructured, the maintenance department was reorganized. Tom's position was given to a younger man who cost less. Tom received a letter thanking him for 30 years of service and wishing him well in his future endeavors. Future endeavors. He was 70 years old with a cancer history. No one was hiring. Maggie's library hours were cut to almost nothing as the town budget tightened. 4 hours a week. The apartment rent proved too much. They fell behind in the first month, further behind in the second. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday. They had 30 days. On the 29th day, Tom loaded the last of their belongings into the Honda Accord. Clothes, sleeping bags, a cooler. The photo album Maggie insisted on bringing. Tom's small toolkit, the one he had carried to work every day for 30 years. Maggie's reading glasses, a Bible that had belonged to Tom's mother. That was it. That was what 45 years of marriage and 70 years of living had been reduced to. A car full of boxes and a wallet with $3.17. For 3 weeks, the Honda Accord had been their home. They parked in different spots each night, behind the gas station, in the lot of a church that did not lock its gates, once in the parking lot of the high school where Tom had worked, though he could not bear to stay there more than one night. They ate the cheapest food they could find, a dollar menu hamburger split between them, water from public fountains refilled in plastic bottles. The cold was the worst. Vermont in November does not forgive. The car's heater worked, but running the engine cost gas they did not have. So they layered blankets and wore every piece of clothing they owned, and still Maggie shivered and coughed, and Tom held her and felt the particular agony of a man who has spent his entire life protecting someone and can no longer do it. And now it was November in Vermont, and Tom's wife was coughing in the back seat, and there were $3.17 in the wallet on the dashboard, and Tom Hollowell sat in the driver's seat at 2 in the morning with his hands on the wheel, going nowhere. Morning came the way Vermont mornings do in November, gray and reluctant, as if the sun itself was not sure the effort was worth it. Tom drove them to the county assistant's office on the fumes left in the tank. They sat in the waiting room among people half their age, and Tom kept his back straight and his chin up because 30 years of working hard and owing nothing had not prepared him for this, for sitting in a plastic chair asking strangers for food. When the clerk asked about current assets, Maggie opened her wallet. 3 ones and some change, $3.17. The clerk looked at them with pity, and Tom felt something die inside him. Not hope. Something older than hope. The image he had carried of himself for 70 years. The self-sufficient man, the reliable provider, the one who never owed anyone anything. That image shattered under the clerk's sympathetic gaze like glass under a boot. Emergency food assistance 3 days. Housing wait list 6 to 8 months. Shelter full. Try again in a week. Tom said quietly as they left, "We don't have 6 to 8 days. November, Vermont. In a car." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Outside, the air was bitter. Tom put his arm around Maggie's shoulders and said, "We will figure it out." But his voice had no conviction in it, and they both knew it. They drove through Riverside because there was nothing else to do, past the library where Maggie had shelved books for 20 years, past the high school where Tom had maintained the grounds and fixed the lockers and been thanked by students who were now adults with children of their own, past Maple Street where their house stood with its new gray door, and Maggie looked away because some things are too sharp to see directly. Then Maggie saw the sign, handwritten, taped to a telephone pole. Estate sale. Everything must go, including property structures. Cash only. An address at the bottom. She said, "Tom, pull over." He looked at her. "We have $3, Maggie." "I know. Just pull over, please." The estate sale was at the edge of town, the old Fenton farmhouse. Harold Fenton had died 6 months ago with no heirs, and his entire life was spread across the front yard for strangers to pick through. Furniture, dishes, tools, the accumulated debris of a life lived and ended. Tom and Maggie walked through the sale slowly touching nothing because everything cost more than they had. A chair, $25, a lamp, $15, a box of books, $8. They were about to leave when Maggie noticed a second sign smaller nailed to a tree away from the main sale. Unwanted structure. Small outbuilding back corner of property. Not maintained. Sold as is. $5 or best offer. They walked to the back of the property, past the house, past the barn, to the very last corner where the land met thick woods. And they're almost invisible beneath a blanket of wild ivy and honeysuckle, and decades of forgetting, was a tiny structure. 10 feet by 10 feet, maybe. Gray wood cracked and splitting. A roof that sagged in the middle like a tired spine. One window broken, one so thick with grime it might as well have been a wall. It looked like something the forest was slowly swallowing and had not yet bothered to finish. The estate sale manager, a man in his late 50s with stained work clothes, walked over. "You folks interested in that thing?" Maggie asked what it was. The man shrugged. "No idea. Been there since before Fenton bought the place, and that was 40 years ago. Sign says $5, but honestly 3, and it is yours. I just need it gone." Tom looked at Maggie. Then he shook his head hard. No, Maggie, no. This is $3, our last $3. Not 300, not 3,000. 3. We spend this and we have nothing. No no food, nothing. I am not letting us die over a pile of rotten wood." Maggie did not argue. She did not plead. She simply said, "Look at it. Really look. Then tell me you do not feel anything." Tom looked. He saw rot and vines and a collapsing roof. He felt nothing but exhaustion and despair. But then he looked at Maggie, and he saw what he had trusted for 45 years. The certainty in her eyes, not hope, not desperation, something deeper. Something that had told her about the stray cat before the rain, about the oak table at the yard sale, about 100 small things that turned out to be true. "Maggie, if I say yes and there is nothing here, we cannot buy a loaf of bread." "I know, and you still want this. I need you to trust me. One more time, the last time." Silence stretched between them, long and heavy. Then Thomas Hollowell, the man who never gambled, never took risks, never bet on anything he could not see and touch and measure, said 2 words that changed everything. "Take it." Maggie pulled out the 3 bills. Tom took them from her hand, looked at them for a moment, then passed them to the manager. Received a handwritten bill of sale and a key so rusted and bent, it looked like it might not work on anything ever. The fine print on the bill of sale indicated that the land beneath the structure, about 500 square feet, was included in the purchase. They now owned a tiny parcel of land at the edge of the old Fenton farm. For the first time in 2 years, they owned property. The crowd from the estate sale had noticed. Whispers first, then open stares, then laughter. Clayton and Judith Davenport, the wealthy couple who had recently purchased one of the large Victorian houses on Main Street, walked over with phones in hand. Judith's voice carried the false sweetness of someone who enjoys other people's misfortune. "Excuse me, did you just purchase that structure? Are you really planning to live here in this?" Tom said, "Yes, ma'am," and his voice was level, but Maggie could feel the muscles in his jaw tighten against her shoulder. Clayton Davenport laughed without trying to hide it. "That is not a house. That is a matchbox. A large dog would not fit comfortably." More comments from the crowd, each one a small blade. $3 for that pile of sticks. More money than sense. I heard they have been living in their car. At their age. It is sad. Really, it is pathetic. Tom and Maggie walked to their car. Through the laughter and the clicking of phone cameras, they got in and sat in silence. Maggie held her head high. Tom's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. But among the onlookers, standing further back than the rest, was a man named Walter Pruitt, 75 years old, thin, white hair. A former carpenter with hands still calloused from 50 years of working wood. He had been their neighbor on Maple Street back when they had a home on Maple Street. Walter did not laugh. He did not take photographs. He watched Tom and Maggie walk away with their heads high, and then he turned and got in his truck and drove off without saying a word. That evening in the failing light, Tom and Maggie returned to the structure. The estate sale had closed, everyone gone. They were alone with what they had bought. Up close in the fading light, it looked even worse. The vegetation covered it so completely that it was hard to tell where plant ended and building began. The wood that was visible had weathered to silver gray, cracked and splitting in places. The door hung slightly crooked beneath a curtain of vines. Tom got out first, then helped Maggie from the car. They stood together looking at what they had purchased for their last $3. "It is small," Tom said, which was an understatement of heroic proportions. "It is ours," Maggie replied. Tom began pulling vines from around the door, revealing the weathered wood beneath. The walls were solid wood planking, old but intact. The roof was covered with ancient shingles, many missing, but the underlying structure seemed to have held. Maggie tried the key. It stuck at first, the mechanism stiff from years of disuse. She jiggled it carefully, patiently, the way she approached everything, and finally the lock clicked open. The door, swollen from moisture and tangled with vines, would not budge. Tom put his shoulder to it and pushed. With a groan of old wood and hinges that had not moved in decades, the door swung inward. The smell hit them first. Mold, mildew, decay, and the musty scent of a space that had not been aired out in years, maybe decades. Tom pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it into the interior. Filth, dirt and dead leaves on the floor, cobwebs hanging from every corner, small animal droppings. But beneath the grime, the floor was intact. Wooden planks that creaked but held. The walls were solid, and the ceiling was higher than expected, maybe 8 feet, giving the tiny space a surprising sense of height, if not width. And there on the far wall, barely visible beneath years of grime and cobwebs, something was carved into the wood. "Tom, look!" He aimed the light where she pointed. Letters cut deep into the wood with purpose and precision. EW 1847. Someone's initials and a date, nearly 180 years ago. Maggie touched the carved letters with her fingertips, feeling the grooves someone had cut into this wood when the Civil War was still 14 years away, when Vermont was still frontier, when this land was forest and river and possibility. She did not know who EW was. She did not know what 1847 meant for this place. But the radar, the instinct, the thing inside her that had never been wrong was singing. Tom watched her face in the dim light. He saw the certainty there, stronger now than it had been at the estate sale, stronger than it had been in years. And for the first time in months, he felt something stir beneath the exhaustion and the shame. Not hope, not yet, but curiosity. And for a man who was drowning, curiosity was sometimes enough to keep his head above the water. Maggie turned to him. Her eyes were bright in the flashlight's glow, and when she spoke, her voice had the quiet force of someone who knows something the rest of the world has not yet figured out. "I told you, this place is special." Tom looked at the carved initials at the walls that had stood for almost 2 centuries, at his wife's face glowing with something he had not seen since before the diagnosis. And the question that would drive everything that followed settled into his mind like a seed into soil. Who was EW? What was this place, and why did it feel in a way he could not explain and did not try to like? They were supposed to be here. Part 2. They spent their first night in the structure that evening, and it was nothing like sleeping in the Honda. It was worse in some ways and better in others. Worse because the floor was hard, and the air smelled of mildew, and something scurried in the corner that Maggie pretended not to hear. Better because there were walls, a roof, a door that closed. After 3 weeks of sleeping in a car, feeling exposed to every passing headlight and every stranger's gaze, the simple act of closing a door between themselves and the world felt like a kind of salvation. They laid their sleeping bags side by side and they touched, because in 100 square feet there was no room for distance. Tom lay on his back staring at the ceiling, and Maggie lay on her side facing the wall where the initials were carved, using the fading light of her phone to trace the letters. EW 1847. Tom said, "You cannot sleep." Thinking, she replied, "About what?" "Tomorrow I want to go to the town hall, the library, look at historical records, find out who EW was." Tom was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Maggie, even if this building has an interesting history, even if EW was somebody, how does that help us? We still have no money, no food, no anything." "I know. But knowledge is the only thing we can get for free right now. And sometimes that is all it takes." He did not answer. But in the darkness, his mind went somewhere he did not expect. He thought about his father, the man who never owed a cent, never asked for help, who died in his own bed in his own house, knowing he had done right by his family. And here was his son, 70 years old, lying on the floor of a 100 square foot shack he had purchased with his last $3. unable to feed his wife, unable to keep her warm, unable to fix a single thing. If his father could see him now, Tom closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep would not come. Only shame. And the sound of Maggie coughing beside him, each cough a reminder of everything he could not do. You know, Maggie said softly into the darkness, as if she could read his silence the way she read everything else. You know, when we first moved into Maple Street, we did not have anything either. Mattress on the floor, ate ramen for a week straight. Tom almost smiled, but that time we were 25, and my back did not hurt. They both laughed, quiet and tired, but real. The sound filled the small space and pushed the darkness back a little. This was their strength, the thing that had carried them through 45 years. Not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but the ability to find a small moment of lightness in the rubble. Morning brought weak gray light through the filthy windows and the reality of what they had chosen. Tom got up first, joints stiff and aching from the hard floor, and stepped outside into air so cold it hurt his lungs. The structure looked even worse in daylight. The vegetation was so thick that from certain angles you could not see the building at all, just a mound of green and brown growing out of the earth like a tumor. But Tom Hollowell was a maintenance man. He had spent 30 years looking at broken things and seeing what they could become. And despite everything, despite the shame and the exhaustion and the gnawing fear, his hands itched to work. Because work was the one thing he still knew how to do. He started pulling vines from the walls. Thick, ropey things, some as wide as his thumb, with roots that had burrowed into the joints between the planks. Maggie swept inside each stroke of the broom, revealing more of the wooden floor beneath decades of dirt and debris. They had been working for less than an hour when the first car slowed down on the road. A newer SUV. The Davenports. Judith stepped out with her phone already raised. "Oh my God," she said loud enough to carry across the property. They actually came back to it. Clayton was already framing photographs. "Get a picture of me in front of it, honey. This is going to be hilarious." Judith called out across the yard. "Are you really planning to live here in this? This is barely bigger than a garden shed." "We will manage," Maggie said evenly. "Thank you for your concern." "Concern," Clayton laughed. "We are not concerned. We are amazed. This is the most ridiculous thing I have ever seen." He took several more photos, making sure Tom and Maggie were in the frame. "Wait until the town sees this. The Hollowells bought a shack for $3 and think they are homeowners." Judith was already typing on her phone. "Posting this right now. Riverside, Vermont. What not to do. You cannot make this up." After the Davenports came Gary Beckett, who had worked with Tom at the high school years ago. He pulled up in his truck and leaned out the window. "Tom, you cannot seriously think that thing is livable. Go to the shelter. Apply for senior housing. Anything but this." Tom did not stop pulling vines. "We will make it work, Gary. Come on, man. Be reasonable. You two should not be out here. This is crazy." "Mind your business, Gary." Gary shook his head, took one more photo before driving off, and said loud enough to hear poor Guy. Must have lost it completely. By mid-morning, there were a dozen people. Some in cars, some who had walked over from town. Watching, recording, commenting. The way people do when someone else's suffering becomes entertainment. "Did you see the Hollowells bought that old shed? $3 for that pile of sticks? More money than sense. I heard they have been living in their car. Can you imagine? At their age, too. It is sad. Really, it is pathetic. Maybe the cancer got to his brain." That last one. Cancer got to his brain. Tom heard it clearly. Every word. He stopped pulling vines. The bundle in his hands went tight. His whole body went rigid. 30 years he had served this town. He had shoveled snow for these people's children. He had fixed their lockers and patched their roofs and never asked for a single thing in return. And now they were standing on the road taking photographs of him like he was an animal in a cage. Maggie watched from the doorway and saw his shoulders trembling, and it was not from the cold. She walked to him. "Tom, take a break." "I am fine." "You are not fine." She came around to face him and put her hands on his face and made him look at her. His eyes were red. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscles jumping beneath the skin. "I am sorry," he said, and his voice broke on the word, the way a branch breaks under too much weight, not clean but ragged and ugly. "I am sorry I cannot give you better than this. Sorry I got sick. Sorry for all of it. You beat cancer. You are alive. You are standing here holding my hand. Everything else will change, but that will not." Maggie people are photographing us to laugh at us. 30 years I served this town. I fixed their homes. I cleared snow for their children. And now I am entertainment. Right now, yes. But I am still right about this place. Trust me. He looked at her. Then he said something she did not expect. I am trying, but you have to give me time. I am not good at trusting when everything is against me. It was the most honest thing either of them had said in months, not the easy agreement of a man going along with his wife. The raw admission of a man who was breaking and knew it and could not stop it. They went back to work. The remaining onlookers eventually got bored and drifted away off to their warm houses and their full refrigerators in their lives that had not collapsed around them. By late afternoon, Tom and Maggie had cleared most of the vines from the exterior, revealing the full structure beneath. It was tiny, yes, weathered and old, absolutely. But it was also solidly built with careful craftsmanship visible in the joinery and the way the boards had been fitted together with a precision that spoke of skill and intention. Then late in the day, when the light was going gold and the crowd was gone, and the only sound was the wind through bare November trees, a truck pulled up. Old, dented, the color of rust and memory. Walter Pruitt climbed out. 75 years old, thin as a fence post but straight as one too, white hair cropped short, hands like leather gloves that had been worn every day for half a century. He had been a carpenter in Riverside for 50 years, building cabinets and shelves and porches and the kind of furniture that people passed down to their grandchildren. He was Tom's former neighbor on Maple Street, the man who had stood silent at the estate sale while everyone else laughed. Walter walked to the back of his truck and opened the tailgate. He lifted out a toolbox, a handsaw, a hammer, a coil of rope, and a brown paper bag. He carried all of it across the yard to where Tom stood, hands full of vines, mouth slightly open. Walter set the toolbox down on the ground, handed Tom the paper bag. Inside were 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, 2 apples, and 2 cans of coffee. Eat, Walter said. Then show me the roof. It looks like it is about to go. Tom stood there with his sandwich in his hand and could not speak. For 3 weeks since losing the apartment, not a single person in Riverside had offered them anything except pity or ridicule or the particular cruelty of looking the other way. And here was Walter Pruitt, a man he knew only from morning nods on Maple Street and the occasional wave across the fence, standing in front of him with sandwiches and a toolbox, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. Walter, why? Walter looked at him with eyes that were sharp despite 75 years of use. Because yesterday I stood and watched this whole town laugh at you, and I did nothing. Went home, looked in the mirror, and saw a coward. Today I did not want to see a coward anymore. Silence. The kind that passes between 2 men of a certain age who understand each other without needing to explain. Tom nodded once, short, complete. It said more than any spoken thanks could have. Walter nodded back, and that was that. They ate the sandwiches. Then 2 old men, 70 and 75, climbed up to inspect the roof. Walter tapped the rafters, tested the ridge beam, ran his calloused hands along the joints, chewed his lip the way carpenters do when they are thinking with their hands rather than their heads. Roof is bad, but the bones are good, Walter said. This wood, whoever built this knew what they were doing. Mortise and tenon joinery, no nails. A real craftsman built this, not some weekend amateur who read a book. Tom said, have you seen the carving on the wall inside? EW 1847. Walter stopped what he was doing. 1847. That is 177 years. He ran his hand along the grain of the wood slowly, the way a doctor feels for a pulse. If that date is right, then this is not junk, Tom. This is history. The next morning, Tom and Maggie walked 3 miles into town because there was no gas money for driving. Walter had offered to drive them. Tom refused. Because even now, even after everything, Thomas Hollowell would not ask for a ride. Maggie gave him the look, the one that said, you are being stubborn again, and then she put on her walking shoes and said nothing else about it because 45 years had taught her which battles to fight and which to let go. The town hall and public library shared a brick building from the 1920s, solid and official. Rachel Underwood was at the front desk. Early 30s, brown hair pulled back. She was the town librarian and also an adjunct professor of Vermont history at the community college, which meant she was both underpaid and deeply passionate about old documents, a combination that was about to prove extraordinarily fortunate for Tom and Maggie Hollowell. When Tom explained they were looking for historical records from 1847 and someone with the initials EW, Rachel's expression shifted from polite to alert in the way that only happens when someone hears the exact thing they have spent their professional life hoping to hear. 1847 is very early for this area, she said. Most of our archive materials start from the 1870s after the town was formally incorporated. But we have some materials in the historical collection that go back further. She led them to a back room. Climate-controlled storage. The air in this room was different, cooler, and drier, treated with the particular reverence that institutions reserve for things they consider worth preserving. Boxes lined the shelves, each one labeled with dates and categories. Maps 1860 to 1900, correspondence pre-incorporation, land surveys territorial period, bills of sale and trade records. Rachel set several boxes on the table and left them to search, returning periodically to check on their progress and bring additional materials. Tom and Maggie sat side by side at the table and began going through the documents. Carefully, page by brittle page. Maggie handled each document the way she handled everything, with patience and attention, reading not just the words, but the spaces between them, looking for what was said and what was implied. Tom's approach was different. He wanted to find what he was looking for, and he wanted to find it now. He was a man built for action, for wrenches and hammers and problems you could see and touch. Sitting in a quiet room turning old papers tested every ounce of patience he had. An hour passed. Maps of Riverside from the 1870s and 1880s showed a town already established with streets and buildings and the infrastructure of organized settlement. But nothing from 1847. Nothing with the initials EW. Tom's leg bounced under the table, the restlessness of a man who had spent his adult life on his feet. A second hour. More documents. Tax records from the 1860s. A bill of sale for livestock dated 1855. A letter from a territorial official discussing road construction in the region. Interesting to a historian perhaps, but useless to two people looking for a specific name from a specific year. Tom was about to speak. He was going to say, "Maggie, this is not working. We are wasting time we do not have." He was going to suggest they leave, go back to their tiny structure, figure out some other way to survive. The words were forming in his mouth when Maggie gasped. The sound she made was not loud, but it carried the weight of discovery. Tom knew that sound. He had heard it before at yard sales and flea markets, and in the quiet moments when Maggie's radar locked onto something the rest of the world had missed. It was the sound of recognition. The sound of a woman who saw things other people could not see, suddenly seeing exactly what she had been looking for. "Tom, look." A letter dated 1846. The paper was yellowed to the color of weak tea, the edges softened by time, crackling faintly when Maggie's careful fingers unfolded it. The handwriting was deliberate and precise. Each letter formed with the consciousness of someone who understood that what they were writing mattered. Not hurried, not careless. The handwriting of a man who took his time because he intended his words to last. The signature at the bottom was clear and confident, the penmanship of a man who signed his name with the authority of someone who knew exactly who he was and what he intended to do. Elijah Winslow. E.W. Elijah Winslow. The letter was addressed to a business associate in Boston, a man named Harrington, and it described Winslow's plans in the kind of specific detail that transforms a name on a page into a living person. He wrote about the land he had scouted near a river crossing in Vermont, a crossing used by trappers and traders moving through the territory. He described the soil as fertile and the timber as abundant. He wrote about clearing a plot of land and building a structure that would serve as both his personal shelter and a trading post for the men who passed through. And then he wrote something that made Maggie's breath catch. "I intend to plant a seed here from which a town may grow. Not for my own glory, for what glory is there in a trading post at the edge of civilization, but because I believe that a man's purpose is to build something that will serve those who come after him. If I build well, and if God grants this enterprise his blessing, then perhaps in 100 years or more, someone will stand where I stand now and know that this place had a beginning, and that beginning was here." Maggie read those words aloud to Tom, a man writing in 1846 about building something for people he would never meet, a man who believed that his purpose was to serve those who came after him. Neither Tom nor Maggie said what they were both thinking, which was that Elijah Winslow sounded like someone they would have understood, someone they would have liked, someone whose values aligned with theirs in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like design. More documents followed as they kept searching with renewed energy. Winslow had arrived in Vermont in 1846, purchased a large tract of land from the state, and built the first permanent structure in what would eventually become Riverside. He operated a trading post and served as an unofficial postmaster, making his tiny building the center of all early settlement activity. The town that grew around his trading post eventually took its name from the river crossing on the White River. Then came the detail that changed everything. A surveyor's report from 1848 described the location of Winslow's original structure with the precision of someone whose profession demanded exactness. Built on the western boundary of his land claim, on a small rise approximately 4 feet above the seasonal flood line, facing southeast, to catch morning light. Dimensions noted as approximately 10 feet by 10 feet. Construction noted as timber frame with mortise and tenon joinery. Maggie pulled out their bill of sale from the estate and compared the legal description of their property to the old survey maps. She laid the documents side by side, the 1848 survey and the modern property description, and her finger traced the matching coordinates. The location matched perfectly. "Our building," Maggie said, and her voice was barely above a whisper, but it filled the room. "Our building is Elijah Winslow's original trading post, the first permanent structure in Riverside, the foundation of the entire town." Tom sat back in his chair and stared at the documents on the table. 2 hours ago, he had wanted to leave. 2 hours ago, he had been ready to call this a waste of time. And now he was looking at evidence that the 100-square-foot shack he had bought for $3, the shack an entire town had laughed at, was the oldest and most historically significant building in Riverside. The irony was so vast he did not know whether to laugh or cry, so he did neither. He just sat there and let it settle. Rachel, who had been helping them search, had found something else. A photograph from 1890, black and white, faded but clear enough. It showed a small building on the outskirts of town, already weathered and abandoned, looking even then, with a handwritten caption beneath it in the careful script of a 19th century archivist. "Old Winslow Trading Post, circa 1847, first structure in Riverside Settlement." The building in the photograph was unmistakably their shack. The same proportions, the same roof line, the same position relative to the tree line. 134 years separated the photograph from the present, but the structure was recognizable, the way a face is recognizable across decades changed by time, but fundamentally the same. Rachel stared at them with an expression that combined professional excitement with personal disbelief. "Do you realize what this means? The Historical Society has been searching for evidence of this location for decades. Everyone assumed it had been torn down a century ago or collapsed under its own weight. No one thought to look under the vines on the back corner of Harold Fenton's property." "How did you find it?" "We bought it at an estate sale," Maggie said simply, "for $3. Everyone thought it was just an old shed." Rachel had her own reasons for caring, they learned later. Her grandmother had been an elderly woman living alone in a small Vermont town, not unlike Riverside, forgotten by her community, who lost her home because no one helped her navigate the property tax paperwork that could have saved it. She died in a state facility 6 months later, and Rachel, who had been in graduate school at the time and did not find out until it was too late, carried that wound like a stone in her pocket, always present, always heavy. When she looked at Tom and Maggie, she saw her grandmother. And this time she was determined not to let history repeat itself. She gave them her card, "I want to help," documenting everything, handling the verification process, navigating the Historical Society. This is too important to let it fall through bureaucratic cracks. Over the following week, Rachel became their ally and guide. She came to the structure every day with cameras and measurement tools, photographing every detail, comparing the carved initials to known samples of Elijah Winslow's handwriting from the archives. The letter formations matched. The depth and style of the cuts matched. It was definitely Winslow's work. She also came with the groceries. When Tom tried to refuse because Tom Hollowell would rather starve than accept charity, Rachel said, "These are research expenses. I cannot have my research subjects going hungry." She said it in a tone that did not accept argument, and Tom, recognizing a stubbornness that matched his own, accepted. Walter came every afternoon with scrap lumber and salvaged materials, patching the roof section by section. He and Tom worked in the way that men of their generation work, side by side, mostly in silence, communicating through the shared rhythm of labor rather than words. When Walter needed a board held, he pointed. When Tom needed a nail, he held out his hand. They built a working relationship the way Walter built furniture joint by joint, without rushing, without wasted motion. On the fifth night, the hailstorm came. Walter had not finished the roof. 3 gaps remained. And when the hail started small at first, then larger, hitting the ancient shingles like a drummer building to a crescendo, water began pouring through. Not dripping, pouring. Tom and Maggie scrambled for pots, buckets, anything that would catch water. They ended up sitting in the middle of their 100 square feet, surrounded by containers filling faster than they could empty them, cold and wet, and listening to the relentless hammering overhead. And Tom broke. He did not break slowly or gracefully. He broke the way things break when they have been holding too long under too much pressure. He stood up and kicked a bucket. Water sprayed across the floor, across their sleeping bags, across the carefully swept boards he had cleaned that morning. "Maggie, I cannot do this anymore." He was shaking. Not from cold, from something much deeper than cold. "What is this?" "History, Elijah Winslow. Who cares? We are sitting in a leaking box in a hailstorm, and you want me to get excited about a letter that is 177 years old." Maggie sat still. She let him speak because she knew he needed to. She had been waiting for this in a way. The anger had been building for months, maybe years, compressed under layers of stoicism and pride, and the iron will that had gotten him through cancer. But pressure does not disappear just because you refuse to acknowledge it. "I beat cancer," Tom said. "I fought. I won. And the reward is what, 70 years old, sitting in 100 square feet, roof leaking, no money. The whole town laughing, my wife coughing every night, and I cannot buy her a bottle of cold medicine. I cannot buy her anything. I cannot do anything. I am useless, Maggie. I am completely and totally useless." The word hung in the air between them, heavier than the hail. Then Maggie said very quietly, "Are you done?" Tom stood there, breathing hard, the anger draining out of him like water through the gaps in the roof, leaving behind only exhaustion that went all the way down to his bones. "Yes." "Good. Now sit down. Tonight we catch water. Tomorrow Walter comes and fixes the roof. The day after I go back to the library and find more. One step at a time, Tom, one step." He sat down heavily on the wet floor. "One step," he repeated the words, sounding hollow but not quite empty. "One step," Maggie confirmed. She reached over and put her hand on his. It was cold and wet, and it was the most comforting thing he had felt in months. They sat together while the hail hammered above them and the buckets filled around them, and it was not comfort exactly, but it was not despair either. It was something in between. It was the stubborn, unglamorous, deeply human act of enduring. 3 days later, the roof patched, and holding Tom was sweeping the floor. He swept every day. It had become ritual, the one thing he could control in a life where control had been stripped from him piece by piece. The cleanliness of this small space was his declaration that he was still here, still functioning, still a man who maintained things. The broom caught on something, a floorboard slightly raised, different from the others, not warped or damaged, but sitting higher as if it had been deliberately loosened, as if it had been lifted and replaced many times over many years. "Maggie, come here." She came from where she had been wiping down the walls. Tom pointed at the board. He pried it up with a screwdriver from the small toolkit Walter had left behind. Beneath was a cavity, about 6 inches deep, running the width of the structure. And in that cavity, resting in the darkness where it had been placed 177 years ago, by hands that are now dust, was a metal box. Iron, heavy, the size of a briefcase, locked with a simple mechanism that had long since surrendered to rust. Tom lifted it from the cavity and felt its weight, the solid, purposeful heft of something made to protect and endure. Whoever had placed this box here had not done so casually. This was deliberate. This was an act of preservation by someone who believed that what they were storing mattered enough to protect from time and moisture and the 1,000 small destructions that eat away at things left unguarded. They carried it outside into the daylight with the care of people who understood, without yet knowing why, that they were holding something that mattered. Rachel, who had been measuring the exterior walls and recording dimensions in her notebook, came running when she saw their faces. The expression on Maggie's face alone told her that something had changed. Tom set the box on the ground and knelt beside it. He worked at the lock with his screwdriver, applying the same patient, precise pressure he had used for 30 years on stuck lockers and jammed doors at the high school. There was no rushing this. The mechanism was frozen with age, the iron swollen with rust, and forcing it would risk damaging whatever was inside. So Tom did what Tom always did. He worked steadily, methodically, listening to the metal with his hands the way Walter listened to wood with his. He found the point where the rust was thinnest, applied gradual pressure, felt the mechanism begin to shift. A grinding sound, like bones moving after a long sleep. Then it opened. The lid swung up and the three of them leaned forward, and for a moment no one spoke because what they were looking at had been waiting in darkness since before the Civil War, since before the telephone, since before the light bulb, since before the automobile, since before the entire modern world that they took for granted had even been imagined. A leather-bound journal. The cover was dry and cracked the way very old leather cracks split along the spine and curling at the corners, but intact. Still holding together after 177 years, which was more than it could be said for most things built by human hands. Maggie lifted it with the reverence of a woman who had spent 20 years working in a library and understood what a book could be. She opened to the first page. The handwriting was the same as the letters they had found at the library, the same careful formation, the same deliberate hand that took its time because it was writing for the future. Journal of Elijah Winslow, Trading Post, Riverside Settlement, Year of Our Lord, 1847. Rachel whispered his journal, a primary source document from the founding of Riverside. Do you understand how rare this is? Most primary source documents from this period in Vermont have been lost to fire flood or simple neglect. This is the kind of thing that historians spend entire careers looking for and never find. Beneath the journal were hand-drawn maps of the early settlement and surrounding territory rendered in ink that had faded from black to brown but remained legible. The maps showed the river crossing the cleared land, the position of the trading post relative to the waterway and the forest. They showed trails used by traders and the rough boundaries of Winslow's land claim. One map included small annotations in Winslow's handwriting, noting the locations of freshwater springs, stands of good timber, and areas prone to seasonal flooding. Below the maps, a stack of correspondence bound with ribbon that had once been red and was now a faded pink, like the memory of a color rather than the color itself. And at the bottom of the box, beneath everything else resting on the iron floor, like the foundation beneath a building, were official documents bearing wax seals that had somehow survived nearly 2 centuries in their iron cocoon. The wax had darkened and cracked, but the impressions were still readable, the marks of authority pressed into softness and hardened by time. Tom carefully unfolded the first document. His hands, the hands of a maintenance man, the hands that had fixed 1,000 broken things, handled the paper with a gentleness that surprised even him. A land grant from the state of Vermont to Elijah Winslow, dated 1846, granting ownership of 640 acres along the White River. The language was formal and precise, the language of government and law, but beneath the formality was something else. A promise, a transfer of responsibility. This land is now yours. What you build on it is your legacy. The second document was a charter signed by representatives of Vermont's territorial government, designating Winslow's trading post as an official postal station and customs point for the region. It granted the trading post certain rights and responsibilities that Tom did not fully understand, but that sounded important, the kind of important that lawyers get excited about. Rachel photographed everything with hands that would not stop trembling, which frustrated her because she was a professional, and professionals do not tremble, but her hands were not listening to her professional judgment. They were listening to the part of her that had spent years studying Vermont history and had just been handed the most significant collection of founding documents she had ever seen outside of a museum. "Do you understand what this is?" she said, and her voice had the quality of someone trying very hard to sound calm while being anything but. "These are the foundational documents of Riverside. The land grant, the charter, the maps. This is the legal and historical framework of the entire town. This is everything." But it was a journal entry from 1850 that stopped all of them cold. Maggie read it aloud, her voice steady but barely above a whisper, giving weight to words that had waited 177 years to be spoken again. May 17th, 1850. "I have established trust with the Territory Office that this settlement shall endure. The charter grants perpetual rights to this trading post, and the lands adjoining it to be held in trust for the settlement's benefit. Should this structure survive, so too shall the original grant of land and its attendant rights. I have secured these documents here beneath the floor of my post that they might be preserved for those who come after." Tom looked up from the journal. "Perpetual rights, land held in trust. What does that mean?" Rachel said slowly, I am not a lawyer. But if this says what I think it says, then whoever owns this structure as the legal successor to Winslow has a claim to certain rights associated with the founding of Riverside. Water rights, access rights, maybe mineral rights for the original 640 acres. The three of them looked at each other in the cramped space of the tiny building. The iron box between them, its contents spread across the floor Tom had swept that morning. Then Tom sat down on that clean floor and he began to laugh. Not bitter laughter, not angry, real laughter, the kind that rises up from somewhere deep and comes out sounding like surprise and relief and the sheer comic absurdity of human existence all at once. Because here he was, a 70-year-old man who had spent his last $3 on a pile of vine-covered wood that an entire town had called garbage, and beneath the floorboards, he had found the founding documents of that same town. You could not write it. You could not make it up. And yet here it was sitting in an iron box on a swept wooden floor in a building no bigger than a parking space. Maggie watched him laugh and felt something she had been carrying for 2 years finally begin to loosen. Not the worry, not the uncertainty. Those would remain for a while yet. But the fear, the deep cold fear that Tom was gone, that the man she had married had been crushed under the weight of illness and poverty and shame, that fear loosened its grip. Because the man sitting on the floor laughing was the Tom she knew. The Tom who had been hiding somewhere behind the exhaustion and the humiliation. He was still in there, and he was coming back. That afternoon, Walter arrived with his usual load of scrap lumber. Tom told him everything. Walter sat on an overturned bucket and listened without interrupting, which was his way. When Tom finished, Walter was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, I have been building with wood for 50 years. I know when something was built by hands that understood the material. This structure was built by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Built it to last. Built it for the future. Now I understand why. That night, Tom lay beside Maggie and said, you were right. About this place. About everything. Maggie smiled in the darkness. You were right too. About what? About trusting me. Outside, the November wind moved through the bare trees, and the tiny structure that Elijah Winslow had built in 1847 stood solid against it, as it had stood against 177 winters before this one. And inside, two people who had lost everything except each other lay together in the warmth of a discovery that was about to change not only their lives, but the life of an entire town that had laughed at them. Rachel was already making calls. The Vermont Historical Society. A property law professor at UVM, the State Historic Preservation Office. The responses were consistent. This was a significant discovery that needed immediate professional evaluation. The experts were coming. The verification was beginning. And the couple that everyone in Riverside had dismissed as crazy old people who wasted their last $3 on a pile of junk were about to become the most important people in the town's history. The laughter was about to stop. Part 3. The experts arrived the way serious people arrive when something serious has been found. Without fanfare. With briefcases and cameras and the careful, measured demeanor of professionals who understand that what they are about to examine could be either a remarkable discovery or an elaborate misunderstanding, and who know better than to assume which before looking. Dr. Helen Archer came first. Vermont Historical Society. A serious woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the particular kind of patience that comes from decades of separating genuine artifacts from wishful thinking. She spent 4 hours inside the tiny structure, examining the wood grain under magnification, studying the joinery with the focused attention of a surgeon, comparing the carved initials to known examples of Elijah Winslow's handwriting from the state archives. She held her magnifying glass so close to the wall that her breath fogged the surface, and she did not rush because Dr. Helen Archer had never rushed anything in her professional life and was not about to start now. When she finally stepped outside into the gray November light, she removed her glasses and looked at Tom and Maggie with an expression that combined professional satisfaction with something rarer. Wonder. This is authenticated, she said. This is absolutely the Elijah Winslow trading post. Every document in that box is genuine period material. The wood dating is consistent with the 1840s. The construction techniques are period appropriate. The handwriting analysis matches known Winslow samples. I have examined enough founding-era structures and documents to stake my reputation on this. You are standing on the founding site of Riverside. Tom said nothing. He just looked at the tiny building, the 100 square feet of wood and history that he had bought for $3, and tried to absorb the fact that the most significant structure in his town's history had been sitting in plain sight for nearly 2 centuries while everyone walked past it. Then came Professor David Garner, property law specialist from the University of Vermont. Tall, careful, the kind of man who reads every word of every document twice because he understands that words have consequences that outlast the people who wrote them. He spent hours with the land grant and the charter making notes in a small leather notebook, cross-referencing with Vermont legal code on his laptop, occasionally looking up with the expression of someone who keeps finding things he did not expect to find. Finally, he sat down with Tom and Maggie on folding chairs that Rachel had brought because the structure was too small for 4 adults and a table full of documents. I need to be very clear, he said. I am not your lawyer. You absolutely need to consult one before making any decisions. But based on what I am seeing in these documents, you have a very strong legal claim to certain historical rights associated with this property. Tom leaned forward. What kind of rights? The charter granted Winslow's trading post perpetual access to river crossing rights. In 1847, that was enormously valuable for commerce. It is less commercially significant now, but the legal principle remains. More importantly, the land grant included mineral rights for all 640 acres. Mineral rights that were never specifically transferred when portions of that land were subdivided and sold over the following decades. He pulled out a modern map of Riverside and overlaid it with Winslow's original hand-drawn map. The overlay was striking. The modern town had grown up directly on top of Winslow's original claim. Schools, businesses, houses, the town hall itself, all sitting on land that had once belonged to the man who carved his initials into the wall of a tiny trading post. If those mineral rights were never properly transferred, and based on what I am seeing they were not, then whoever owns this structure as Winslow's legal successor has a claim to those rights. Additionally, there are water access rights that several businesses are currently using without proper authorization. He set down his notebook and looked at them both. I would estimate you are looking at a total potential settlement of approximately $3 million, possibly more depending on how various claims are negotiated. $3 million. The number entered the room and changed the air the way the cancer diagnosis had changed the air 2 years ago, except in the opposite direction. 2 years ago, the future had collapsed. Now it was expanding so rapidly and so unexpectedly that neither Tom nor Maggie could process it. Tom said, "Say that again." 3 million, possibly more. Tom looked at Maggie. She looked at him. Neither spoke. 2 months ago, they had been sleeping in a Honda Accord with $3.17. They had bought a structure that an entire town called garbage. They had been laughed at, photographed, for social media mockery, pitied, and dismissed as crazy. And now a professor of law from the state university was sitting in a folding chair on their property, telling them they were potentially worth $3 million. Dr. Archer added to the enormity. Because this structure is clearly the founding building of Riverside and is in remarkably significant condition for its age, it qualifies for immediate listing on the National Register of Historic Places. That comes with protections and benefits, including preservation grants. $150,000 has already been identified as available for structures of this exceptional significance. Over the following weeks, the machinery of verification and legal process began to turn. Laura Bennett, a lawyer specializing in historic property claims, took their case pro bono. She would take a percentage of any settlement, making it worth her time without requiring money the Hollowells did not have. Laura was efficient and relentless. She filed claims with the Vermont State Property Office, submitted applications for National Register status, and began the painstaking process of tracing the chain of title for Winslow's original 640 acres. The National Register designation came through in 6 weeks. The Winslow Trading Post was officially recognized as a National Historic Site of exceptional significance. The preservation grant of $150,000 was approved. Laura's title search confirmed what Garner had suspected. The mineral rights for the original 640 acres had never been properly transferred in multiple transactions over the decades. Her final estimate was consistent with Garner's assessment. Approximately $3 million in mineral rights claims, an additional $500,000 to $800,000 in water access rights. Total potential value somewhere north of $3.5 million. And then the complications began because money, even potential money, changes everything. Word moved through Riverside the way it always moves through small towns. Not through official channels, but through conversations at the diner, at the hardware store, after church, in the parking lot of the grocery store. The whisper network was faster than any newspaper. By the end of the first week, everyone in Riverside knew the essential facts. The Hollowell Shack was the founding building of the town. The documents found inside were worth a fortune. The couple everyone had mocked was sitting on millions. The reaction rippled outward in concentric circles of human nature at its most predictable. First came disbelief. That cannot be right, that shack. Then came the uncomfortable silence of people who had posted mocking photographs on social media and were now quietly deleting them, hoping no one had taken screenshots. The Davenports temporarily locked their Facebook accounts. Then came anxiety as property owners whose land sat on Winslow's original 640 acres began to realize that their mineral rights were legally questionable. Then came the most predictable reaction of all, the sudden and convenient discovery by numerous Riverside residents that they had in fact always believed in the Hollowells. The town council held an emergency meeting. Councilman Warren Blake, a real estate developer who owned multiple properties within the original Grant area, spoke with the controlled urgency of a man whose financial interests were directly threatened. We should acquire the structure. It belongs to the town, not to private individuals. The town should purchase it at a fair price. Blake was not a villain. Tom understood that. Blake was a practical man protecting practical interests. If the mineral rights claims held up every property he owned would have what lawyers call a clouded title, meaning their ownership was legally uncertain, meaning their value dropped, meaning Blake's net worth dropped with it. His desire to resolve the situation quickly was rational, even if his method of resolution conveniently involved taking the structure away from the people who had found it. Rachel stood from the audience. With respect, Councilman, the Hollowells owned the property legally. They purchased it in a legitimate sale. The town had decades to recognize this building and chose not to. They saw what no one else could see. We should be thanking them, not trying to take what is theirs. They paid $3, Blake countered. That was all they had, Rachel said, and it was $3 more than anyone else was willing to pay. Mayor Joan Prescott brought order to the room. This discussion is premature. The Hollowells have not expressed any desire to sell, and I will say what others are thinking, but not saying. Given how this town has treated Tom and Maggie Hollowell, the mockery, the photographs, the public humiliation, we have no right to ask them for anything. We owe them an apology before we owe them a proposal. She looked directly at Tom and Maggie, who sat quietly in the back of the room. I am sorry, she said. On behalf of Riverside, I am sorry for how you have been treated. The night before the January council meeting, 4 people sat in the tiny structure that had been transformed over the past weeks from a forgotten ruin into a clean, solid, warm space. The roof was tight, thanks to Walter. The walls had been wiped down to reveal the beautiful old wood beneath the grime. The carved initials glowed in the lamplight like a signature from across the centuries. Tom, Maggie, Rachel, and Walter. Rachel had brought the confirmed numbers from Laura Bennett. 3 million, maybe more. Walter left first, as he always did, with a nod and no words. Rachel followed. Then it was just the two of them, the way it always came back to the way it had been for 45 years. Tom spoke first. $3 million, Maggie. 3 million. We buy a house anywhere. Warm, safe. We never worry about money again. We never sleep in a car again. We never sit in a county assistant's office with $3 in our wallet again. Maggie was quiet for so long that Tom wondered if she had fallen asleep. She had not. Do you remember the hospital, she said. The worst night of chemo. You were vomiting and I was sitting in the hallway trying to get the insurance company on the phone at 2 in the morning. There was an old woman sitting next to me on the bench. Her husband had cancer too, but she had no insurance. No money, no one. She was sitting there alone at 3 in the morning crying, and not a single person walking past in that hallway stopped to ask if she was all right. Not one. Nurses, doctors, other families, they all walked past her like she was invisible. Tom said, you never told me about that. I never told anyone. But I have thought about her every single day since. When we lost the house, when we slept in the car, when we sat in that assistant's office, I understood her. I knew exactly what she felt. The invisibility, The sense that the world has decided you do not matter anymore because you are old and you are poor and you have nothing left to offer. Maggie, $3 million, Tom. We can live comfortably for the rest of our lives, or we can make sure that no one in Riverside ever has to sit alone at 3 in the morning again. Tom was quiet for a long time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded dollar bill. He had kept it, one of the $3 they had spent. He had told Maggie they spent all three, but he had held one back because he could not bear the thought of owning absolutely zero. It was the only lie he had told her in 45 years of marriage, and it was a small one born of the same pride that made him refuse rides and decline charity. "Did you know I kept this?" he said, holding the bill in the lamplight. Maggie looked at the dollar and smiled the way she smiled when she knew something no one else did. "I knew since the first day. After 45 years, you think I cannot tell when you are lying. Thomas Hollowell, you are terrible at it. You always have been." They laughed. In their tiny house surrounded by 177 years of history, they laughed the way people laugh when they realize that being known completely by another person is not a weakness, but a gift. Then Tom grew serious. "If we give away the money, what do we live on? The foundation will pay a caretaker's salary. We live on the property. It will not be luxury, but it will be enough. Like Maple Street was enough. But this time was something bigger than just ourselves." Tom thought about his father, the man who built a house with his own two hands for his family. He had spent 2 years measuring himself against that image and feeling like a failure. His father had built for family. He had been unable even to do that. But sitting here in a building that Elijah Winslow had built not for himself, but for a settlement for a future he would never see, Tom understood something he had missed. His father had built for family. That was enough. But Tom could build for everyone. That was not failure. That was something more than his father ever had the chance to do. "Okay," he said, "no Florida." "You hate the heat anyway," Maggie said. "I hate the heat." They smiled at each other in the lamplight, and then they planned. The January town council meeting was the most attended in Riverside's history. Every seat taken, people standing along the walls, more crowding the hallway outside, straining to hear. Tom and Maggie sat in the front row at Mayor Prescott's invitation, dressed in the best clothes they owned, which were not fancy but were clean and pressed and dignified. Laura Bennett sat beside them with a folder of documents. In the audience, Warren Blake, the Davenports, Gary Beckett, and in the back row, silent and still as a stone wall, Walter Pruitt. Mayor Prescott called the meeting to order and introduced Maggie. Maggie stood up slowly. She smoothed her skirt with her hands, a habit from decades of standing up in front of library patrons to announce reading programs. Her gray hair was neatly styled. Her back was straight. She looked, Tom thought, like the woman he had married 45 years ago. Strong, certain, unbreakable. 3 months ago she began, and her voice was clear and steady and reached every corner of the room. 3 months ago, my husband Tom and I purchased a small structure for $3. All the money we had in the world. We had lost everything to medical debt after Tom's cancer treatment. We had been living in our car. We were desperate. She paused and looked around the room, making eye contact with person after person, giving each one a moment to see her and be seen by her. Many of you in this room laughed at us. Some of you took photographs and posted them on social media to mock us. You called us crazy, pathetic, senile. One person said the cancer must have gotten to Tom's brain. The silence in the room was absolute. Several people studied the floor with intense concentration. We did not buy that structure because we thought it was valuable. We bought it because we needed shelter, and it was all we could afford. But I felt something when I looked at it. I have always felt things, known things, before I could explain them. And when I looked at that tiny shack covered in vines, I felt that it was meant to be ours. It turned out I was right. She nodded to Laura Bennett, who began distributing copies of a document to the council members. "We now have a legal claim to mineral and water rights worth approximately $3 million. We own the most historically significant structure in Riverside. We have been offered substantial sums to sell the property or license various rights." She let that number sit in the room. Let people do the math in their heads. $3 million for a structure purchased for $3. A 1,000,000-to-1 return on investment. The kind of number that makes people rethink everything they thought they knew about value and worth and the reliability of their own judgment. Then she said the words that no one in the room expected to hear. "But Tom and I have made some decisions I want to share with you tonight. The room shifted. People leaned forward. Even the ones standing in the back craned their necks to see. First, regarding the mineral rights. We recognize that many property owners in Riverside purchased their land in good faith, not knowing about the complication with mineral rights. These are your homes, your businesses, places where you have raised your children and built your lives. We understand what it means to have your home threatened by forces beyond your control because that is exactly what happened to us. We do not want to profit from your uncertainty. So we are proposing a one-time settlement. Any property owner who can document a good faith purchase of land within Winslow's original 640 acres can purchase clear title to their mineral rights for $100 per parcel, regardless of size. The murmur that went through the room was like a wave breaking against a wall. $100. Some of the properties in question were worth hundreds of thousands. The mineral rights alone, if enforced through litigation, could have cost those owners tens of thousands each. $100 was not a settlement. It was a gift wrapped in the language of fairness. Warren Blake sat forward in his chair and did the mathematics in his head, and his expression underwent a visible transformation. The guarded suspicion of a real estate developer protecting his portfolio gave way to something more complicated. Something that looked, despite his best efforts to prevent it, very much like respect. Second, the water access rights, which are valued at $500,000 to $800,000, we are donating to the town of Riverside, in perpetuity, with the stipulation that they be used for public benefit and that no commercial entity can monopolize access. Water is not a commodity, it is a necessity. It belongs to everyone. Mayor Prescott said, Mrs. Hollowell, those rights are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. You understand that? I understand it perfectly, Maggie replied. And I understand that there are things more important than money. There was a time not long ago when Tom and I could not afford a glass of clean water. When we were refilling plastic bottles from public fountains because we did not have a faucet of our own. I will not put a price tag on something that should be free. The room was very quiet now, the kind of quiet that happens when people are witnessing something they did not expect and are trying to decide how to feel about it. Third, we are not selling the Winslow Trading Post. We are establishing the Winslow Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving the structure and using it as a base to help others. The preservation grant of $150,000 will restore the building with historical accuracy. After restoration, it will serve as a community resource center focused on helping elderly residents in a crisis. Emergency assistance, food support, help with medical bills and paperwork and insurance appeals, and all the things that seem impossible when you are old and alone and frightened, and the system that is supposed to protect you feels like a maze designed to keep you out. She paused and looked directly at the audience. Tom and I know what it is like to have nothing. We know what it is like to be mocked and dismissed because you are poor and old. We know what it is like to sit in a waiting room and be told that help is 6 to 8 months away when you do not have 6 to 8 days. We do not want anyone else to go through that alone. Not in this town, not while we are alive to do something about it. Tom stood beside her. His voice when he spoke had the quiet solidity of a man who has spent his life maintaining things and knows that the best work is the work that does not draw attention to itself. We will live on the property as caretakers. We will run the foundation. Every additional dollar from settlements or donations will go to helping someone who needs it. We are not doing this for recognition. We are doing this because it is the right thing to do and because we have been given the chance to do it, and it would be wrong to waste that chance on ourselves. Warren Blake rose to his feet. You are giving away millions of dollars. Are you certain about this? Tom looked at the man. We do not need millions. We need a home, enough to live on, and a reason to get up in the morning. The foundation gives us all three. Then from the back of the room came the sound of a chair scraping as someone stood. The room turned. Walter Pruitt was on his feet. Walter, who in 75 years of living in Riverside had spoken publicly perhaps 5 times. Walter, who communicated through nods and handshakes and the quality of his work rather than the quantity of his words. I want to say something, he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of a man who had saved his words for 75 years and was now spending them carefully the way he spent everything. I am a carpenter. 50 years I have worked with wood. I know wood the way some men know engines or numbers or the law. I know when something has been built by hands that understand the material. And I have examined that structure with my own hands, every joint, every board, every inch. He paused. Elijah Winslow built that trading post with the hands of a man who understood wood and time and purpose. He built it to outlast him. He built it for people he would never meet. He carved his initials into the wall not out of vanity, but as a promise that what he built would endure. Walter looked at Tom. Tom Hollowell is that kind of man. 30 years he maintained the school where our children learn to read and add and become decent people. He arrived at 5 in the morning to clear the snow. He fixed every broken thing without being asked and without asking for thanks. 3 generations of Riverside children called him Mr. Tom, and every one of them knew that he would help them without judgment and without hesitation. Walter's voice, which had been steady, now hardened like the oak he had spent his life shaping. And when this man fell down, when cancer took his health and medical bills took his home, and poverty took his dignity, what did we do? We laughed. We took photographs. We posted them online. We called him crazy and pathetic and worse. Some of you know I showed up the second day with tools and sandwiches. What you do not know is why. I showed up because the night before I did not sleep. I kept seeing Tom's face when those people were laughing. The face of a man who had fixed things for this town for 30 years, standing there with vines in his hands, and tears he would not let fall. And I knew that if I did not get in my truck the next morning, I would never be able to look at myself again. He looked around the room, making eye contact with person after person, the way Maggie had, but with none of her grace and all of the blunt force of a man who has swung a hammer every day of his working life. Tom and Maggie Hollowell had $3 in faith. That is all. $3 in the belief that a pile of vine-covered wood was worth something that nobody else could see. And they were right. They bought back the history of our town. They found the documents that tell us who we are and where we came from. And instead of keeping the reward, instead of taking the money and leaving this town that treated them so badly, they are giving it away. They are using their miracle to help the people who mock them. He paused. If that is crazy, then I want to be that kind of crazy. And I think every person in this room should ask themselves whether they would have the courage to do the same. Walter sat down. The room was silent. Then someone started clapping. A single pair of hands. Then another. Then the entire room rising to their feet, the sound building and filling the space, until it felt like the walls might not be able to contain it. Mayor Prescott stood at the podium, openly wiping tears from her face. In 30 years of public service, she said, "This is the most extraordinary act of generosity and grace I have witnessed." The Hollowells lost everything. They were treated with cruelty by the community they had served for decades. And their response is not anger, not litigation, not revenge. Their response is to help, to build something that ensures no one in Riverside will ever face what they faced alone. That is not just generosity, that is the definition of character. The council voted unanimously to accept the proposals and to provide ongoing municipal support for the Winslow Foundation. After the vote, the line of people waiting to speak to Tom and Maggie stretched to the door and beyond. The Davenports came first. Judith Davenport was crying. "We owe you an apology. What we did, taking photos, posting them, making jokes, it was cruel. It was wrong. We are ashamed of ourselves, and we should be." Maggie said, "Thank you for saying that. We forgive you." Clayton Davenport said, "We want to make a donation to the foundation. A substantial one, if you will accept it." Tom said, "We will accept it, and we will use it to help someone who needs it." Gary Beckett was next. He approached Tom and could not meet his eyes. He stood there for a moment, struggling with something, and finally said, "I was a lousy friend, Tom. Lousy. Called you crazy when you needed help. I am sorry." Tom looked at Gary, the man who had leaned out of his truck and told him to go to a shelter, the man who had taken a photograph and shaken his head and driven away. Tom had known Gary Beckett for 20 years. They had worked in the same building, shared coffee in the maintenance room, complained about the same broken equipment. It was not friendship exactly, but it was the kind of daily proximity that builds something between people. Something that should have been strong enough to survive a crisis. It was not. But that did not mean it could not be repaired. Tom extended his hand. Gary took it. 2 men shaking hands in a crowded room, one asking forgiveness and the other granting it in the most efficient way he knew. "Forget it," Tom said. 2 words, complete. As they left the town hall that night, the cold January air hitting their faces, Rachel walked out with them. She stopped on the steps and looked at them under the yellow glow of the street lamp. "You know," she said, "you could have been millionaires. You could have taken the money and moved to Florida and lived comfortably for the rest of your lives. No one would have blamed you. After what this town put you through, most people would have taken the money and never looked back. We could have Maggie agreed. So why didn't you? Maggie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, because that is not who we are. And honestly, Rachel, we are richer now than we would have been with $3 million in the bank. Rachel looked skeptical, which was fair because she was 32 years old and had student loans, and the concept of choosing purpose over money was easier to admire in theory than to understand in practice. How do you figure that? We have a home, we have purpose, we have the chance to help people who need it, and we have each other, which is the part that was never really in question. That is wealth that actually matters. You cannot deposit it in a bank, but you also cannot lose it to a medical bill. Tom put his arm around Maggie's shoulders the way he had put his arm around her outside the county assistant's office 3 months ago, except this time the gesture did not carry the weight of desperation. This time it carried something else. Certainty. The certainty of a man who had lost everything, found something unexpected, and chosen to use it in a way that would have made his father proud. Not because he built a house with his own hands, but because he built something bigger. Walter was already in his truck, engine running, waiting to drive them back to the property. He did not offer a ride. He simply sat there with the passenger door open because after 3 months of working side by side with Tom Hollowell, he had learned the precise calibration of help that Tom would accept. Not offered, just available. Tom hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then he helped Maggie into the truck and climbed in after her. "Thank you, Walter," Maggie said. Walter nodded once and put the truck in gear. They drove through Riverside in silence, past the houses and businesses built on Elijah Winslow's land, past the high school where Tom had worked for 30 years, past the spot on Maple Street where their old house stood, with its gray door, past the gas station where they had slept in their car 3 months ago. The town looked different at night, softer the rough edges, hidden by darkness, the lights in windows suggesting warmth and safety, and all the ordinary comforts that Tom and Maggie had lost and were now slowly beginning to rebuild. Over the following months, the work of transformation began. The preservation grant funded the careful restoration of the trading post, supervised by Dr. Archer and executed by a team of craftsmen who specialized in historical structures. Walter oversaw the construction work with the exacting standards of a man who had spent 50 years building things that lasted. He rejected materials that did not meet his specifications. He personally inspected every joint and every board. He told the younger workers more than once that they were not building something new. They were honoring something old. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. Tom worked alongside them every day, not as a supervisor, not as the owner, as a laborer, because that was who Thomas Hollowell was and who he would always be. A man who worked with his hands, a man who maintained things. The building that Elijah Winslow had built in 1847 would be maintained for another 177 years if Tom Hollowell had anything to say about it. The community center went up next, funded by the mineral rights settlements and the donations that kept coming, many from people who had stood on the road and laughed and now wanted to make it right. The Davenport's contribution was the largest enough to fund the food pantry for its first 2 years. Clayton Davenport delivered the check himself, and when he handed it to Maggie, he looked like a man who had discovered that writing a check was the easiest and least satisfying form of atonement, and that the harder work of actually being a decent person was still ahead of him. 1 year later, on a September evening, when the Vermont air had that particular quality of warmth and gold that comes just before the leaves turn and the world catches fire, Tom and Maggie sat on the newly built porch of their restored home and watched the sun settle over Riverside. The transformation was remarkable. The tiny 100-square-foot structure had been lovingly restored using the preservation grant and the donations that had followed the council meeting. Every board had been treated and preserved by craftsmen who understood what they were handling. The roof rebuilt with historically appropriate materials no longer leaked. The windows restored with period-accurate glass caught the evening light and held it. Inside, the space was clean and bright and carefully maintained, a tiny museum of the town's origin. The carved initials E.W. 1847 and the inscription Foundation Stone, First Structure, Riverside were preserved behind protective glass. The floor where they had found Winslow's iron box now bore a brass plate telling the story of the discovery. But the original structure was now just one part of something larger. Adjacent to it, connected by a covered walkway that Walter had designed and built himself, stood the Winslow Foundation Community Center. It was modest by any standard, but it was more than Tom and Maggie had ever imagined. Offices for the foundation staff, a meeting room where elderly residents could come for help with paperwork and benefits applications, and the countless small, bureaucratic battles that become overwhelming when you are old and alone. A food pantry stocked by donations from the community that had once laughed at the Hollowells and now contributed monthly. An emergency fund that had already prevented 6 families from losing their heat during the previous winter. 3 employees kept the foundation running. Rachel Underwood had left her teaching position to serve as director, bringing the same meticulous attention to helping people that she had once brought to cataloging old documents. A social worker named Beth handled intake and case management. An administrative assistant kept the machinery of nonprofit governance turning. But Tom and Maggie were the heart of the operation. They lived on site in a small addition built onto the back of the community center. Nothing extravagant, 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it was theirs and it was warm, and it had a porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun go down. Walter Pruitt came 3 days a week. Officially, he was a volunteer maintenance worker. Unofficially, he was Tom's best friend, though neither man would ever use those words. They had built the bookshelves for the foundation's reading room together. Oak, mortise in tenon joinery. Not a single nail. The same technique Elijah Winslow had used to build the trading post 177 years earlier. It was the bookshelf Tom had started building for Maggie on the back porch of Maple Street, the one he thought he would never finish. He finished it. But instead of going in their living room, it went in a room where anyone could come and sit and read, and that was better. That was what it was always supposed to be, even if he did not know it at the time. In 1 year, 43 elderly individuals and couples in Riverside had been helped by the Winslow Foundation. Small interventions mostly, but there is nothing small about preventing a disaster. There was Eleanor Marsh, 81 years old, a widow living alone on Pine Street, whose electric company had sent a final disconnect notice. She had been sitting in the dark for 2 days, afraid to call anyone, because she had always been the one who helped others and could not bear the reversal. Rachel found out through the church network and sent Tom. He showed up at Eleanor's door with a flashlight and a check that covered 3 months of back payments. Eleanor cried. Tom said, "This is what we are here for. You do not have to sit in the dark." There was Frank DeMello, 73, a retired truck driver, whose insurance company had denied his heart medication for the 3rd time. Frank had been cutting his pills in half to make them last, a dangerous practice his doctor had warned him about repeatedly. The foundation covered 6 months of medication costs, while Laura Bennett, who had stayed on as a legal advisor, filed a formal complaint with the state insurance commissioner. The insurance company reversed their decision within 2 weeks. Frank told Tom that he had been ready to give up. Not on the medication, on everything. Tom understood what he meant because Tom had been there too. There was a couple, Gerald and Iris Whitfield, both in their late 70s, who had fallen behind on their property taxes after Gerald's stroke. They were facing the loss of a house they had lived in for 40 years. The foundation could not pay the full amount, but Rachel organized a community fundraiser that covered the rest, and Maggie helped Iris navigate the paperwork for a property tax exemption for seniors that Iris had not known existed. Each case taught Tom and Maggie something about the particular loneliness of growing old in a society that measures worth by productivity. These were people who had worked their entire lives, raised children, paid taxes, contributed to their communities in 1,000 small ways that no one counted. And when they stumbled, when health failed, or money ran out, or the system proved too complicated to navigate alone, they discovered what Tom and Maggie had discovered: that the world stops seeing you, that you become invisible, that the phone stops ringing and the neighbors stop waving, and the institutions that are supposed to help you require a level of persistence and paperwork that would challenge a healthy 30-year-old, let alone a frightened 80-year-old with failing eyesight and no internet access. The foundation could not fix the system, but it could make sure that in Riverside at least no one fell through the cracks alone. Walter Pruitt came 3 days a week. Officially, he was a volunteer maintenance worker. Unofficially, he was Tom's best friend, though neither man would ever use those words, because men of their generation expressed friendship through action rather than declaration. They communicated in the language of shared labor. A board held steady while the other man sawed. A cup of coffee placed on the workbench without being asked for. A nod that meant good work. Another nod that meant, I know. They had built the bookshelves for the foundation's reading room together. Oak, mortise and tenon joinery, not a single nail. The same technique Elijah Winslow had used to build the trading post 177 years earlier. Tom had started those bookshelves on the back porch of Maple Street before the diagnosis, before everything fell apart. He thought he would never finish them. But here they were, completed at last, standing in a room where anyone could come and sit and read. Not in his living room as he had originally planned, in everyone's living room, and that was better. One afternoon while they were staining the shelves, Walter said something that Tom would carry with him for the rest of his life. They were working in silence as usual when Walter stopped, brush in hand, and looked at the wood they had shaped. You know what I like about building, he said. When you build something, it does not care who you are. It does not care if you are rich or poor or sick or healthy or old or young. It only cares if you did it right, if the joints are tight, if the wood is true, if the thing you made will stand. He dipped his brush and went back to work. Tom understood. Building was honest in a way that the rest of the world often was not. A shelf was a shelf. It held books or it did not. It stood straight or it did not. There was no politics in it, no favoritism, no insurance company denying your claim. Just wood and skill and the satisfaction of making something that worked. Tom pulled something from his pocket as they sat on the porch that September evening. A wooden frame 4 inches by 6 that he had made himself in the workshop Walter had set up for him behind the community center. Inside the frame was the dollar bill, the one he had kept, the one small lie in 45 years of marriage. He had taken it to a framer the week before, but the framer had wanted $40, and Tom had said that was absurd for a piece of glass and some wood, and he had made the frame himself. Because that was who Tom Hollowell was. He made things with his hands. He always had. He always would. He hung the framed dollar bill on a nail beside the front door of their home. Below it, he attached a small brass plate on which he had carefully engraved using a set of tools Walter had given him. The value of something is not its price. It is what you are willing to see in it. Maggie leaned against his shoulder the way she had leaned against him 10,000 times before. The way she would lean against him 10,000 times more. Because that was what a lifetime together looked like. Not the dramatic moments, not the discoveries or the crises or the speeches in crowded rooms. But this. 2 people sitting together at the end of a day, leaning into each other, watching the light change. We have come a long way from the Honda, she said. That we have. Rachel's car pulled into the lot, bringing the week's intake forms. Inside the community center, Beth was on the phone with an elderly man whose heating had been shut off. By morning, it would be back on. In the reading room, the oak bookshelves Tom and Walter had built held books that anyone could borrow. And on Wednesday afternoons, Maggie ran a reading group for seniors who had discovered that loneliness was a sickness too, and that a room full of people discussing a book was a kind of medicine. Do you ever regret it? Tom asked. Not taking the money, not going somewhere warm. Not for a second, Maggie said. This is exactly where we are supposed to be. Tom said, I spent 2 years thinking about my father, thinking I had failed because he built a house and I could not even keep one. But he built for his family. We built for everyone. That is not failure. No, Maggie agreed. That is not failure. Silence settled between them, comfortable and complete, the way it had settled between them on the back porch of Maple Street on 1,000 Sunday afternoons. The same silence, the same 2 people, but different now, tempered by what they had survived, expanded by what they had chosen to build. Do you know what I learned, Maggie said after a while? When we had everything, the house, the savings, the stability, I thought that was security. I thought that was what made life safe and good. But when we lost it all, when we were down to $3 in a car that smelled like fast food, I learned something. Security is not about how much you have. It is about what you do with what you are given. We were given this chance, this discovery, this miracle if you want to call it that, and using it to help others is a kind of security that no medical bill can take away. No eviction notice can destroy it. No bad luck can touch it. Tom looked at the tiny structure behind them, 100 square feet of wood that had been standing since 1847. The matchbox, the pile of junk, the stupidest purchase anyone in Riverside had ever made. This little building, he said, everyone laughed at us for buying it, and now it is the most important building in Riverside, Maggie said, not because of its size, because of what it represents. Beginnings, foundation. The idea that something small can be the start of something great. Like $3, Tom said. Like $3, Maggie agreed. He reached over and took her hand, the same hand he had reached for 10,000 times in 45 years. The gesture was so automatic, so ingrained, that he did it without thinking the way you breathe, without thinking the way your heart beats, without instruction. And that was the point. After 45 years, love was not something you decided to do. It was something you were. It was the hand that reaches without being told, the shoulder that offers itself without being asked. Below them, Riverside spread out in the fading light. 4,000 people going about their lives in a town built on land that had once belonged to a man named Elijah Winslow, a man who had come to Vermont with a vision and a set of tools and the belief that what he built would matter to people he would never meet. He was right. It took 177 years, but he was right. And the people who proved him right were not scholars or historians or wealthy collectors. They were a maintenance man and a part-time librarian in their late 60s, homeless, nearly penniless, dismissed by the world as used up and worthless. They had $3 and each other and a feeling that a pile of vine-covered wood was worth believing in. That was enough. Before Tom closed the door that night, he touched the framed dollar bill one last time. His fingers rested on the glass for a moment, feeling the cool surface, thinking about what that single bill represented. Not money. Money was just paper and ink and the collective agreement that it meant something. No, that dollar bill represented the moment when he and Maggie had been standing in front of a forgotten shack at the edge of an estate sale with nothing in the world except $3 and each other, and they had chosen to believe. $3 had cost them 100 square feet of rotting wood covered in vines. It had also bought them dignity, purpose, a home, a foundation that had already changed 43 lives and would change many more, the respect of a town that had written them off, and the knowledge earned through suffering and confirmed through generosity that the value of a thing is never determined by what it costs, but by what you are willing to see in it. The town that had mocked them now honored them. The structure that had been called worthless was now priceless. The couple that had been dismissed as crazy was now recognized as the wisest people in Riverside. And a man named Elijah Winslow, who had carved his initials into a wall in 1847 and buried his documents under the floor, with a note that said, "Should this structure survive, so too shall the original grant," was finally proven right. His structure had survived, and the people who found it had done something with it that he would have understood because it was exactly what he had done himself. They had built something meant to outlast them. Tom closed the door. Inside, Maggie was already in bed, reading by lamplight, her glasses perched on her nose, her gray hair spread across the pillow. She looked up when he came in and smiled, and it was the same smile she had given him on their wedding day, the same smile she had given him on the back porch of Maple Street, the same smile she had given him in the parking lot of the estate sale when she said, "Trust me one more time." Tom smiled back. He turned off the porch light and got into bed beside his wife and listened to the sound of the Vermont night outside their window. Wind in the trees, an owl somewhere, the creak of the old trading post settling as it had settled every night for nearly 2 centuries, solid and patient and enduring. He closed his eyes. He slept well,